The MIU video magazine documents the rising progress and fulfillment in all areas of life, from the applications of Maharishi's Vedic science and technology. Founded by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the magazine highlights the knowledge and achievements of Maharishi International University and the Super Radiance community of Fairfield, Iowa, USA, creating heaven on earth for all mankind. Volume 7, Tape 2. Is Consciousness the Unified Field? By John Hagelin, Ph.D., Professor of Physics, Director of the Institute of Science, Technology, and Public Policy, Maharishi International University. Introduction by Robert Keith Wallace, Ph.D., Professor of Physiology, Executive Vice President, Maharishi International University.
It's a very great honor for me to introduce Dr. John Hagelin. Dr. Hagelin is a close friend and a man of remarkable talents. On the one hand, he is a world-class physicist, among a very few who have the ability to examine that finest layer of creation and describe it in very precise and exact scientific terms. He received his PhD from Harvard University in physics and then went on to two very prestigious laboratories, the CERN laboratory in Geneva, Switzerland, and the Stanford Linear Accelerator Laboratory in California. He currently is the chairman of MIU's physics department and the director of our doctoral program in physics. While he's been at MIU, he has published a number of very important papers that have had great impact on the physics community and really on the whole scientific community at large. One particular paper, which was done with several other collaborators, was concerned with the creation of a successful grand unified theory, a theory known as the flipped SU5. And this theory really describes that finest layer of creation and is of such significance that it's really something worthy of the Nobel Prize. Many individuals and many writers have commented on the great success of John, and he has won a number of very important awards as a result of this really great achievement in the field of physics. But this is only one of John's accomplishments. On the other hand, he's a man who is very concerned with the current problems in America, very concerned with practical solutions. This is not the theory of physics now. These are very practical solutions to our problems of crime, our problems of the environment, of economy, of health. He is the director of MIU's Institute of Science, Technology, and Public Policy. And in this role, he meets with top leaders in government, top businessmen, with those individuals who are most concerned with solving the problems of America today. Again, these are only two sides of John. Really, I would say the most profound side of John is his role as an individual who has worked for many years now with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the founder of Maharishi International University. In this role, he has brought an understanding of modern physics to Maharishi and worked very closely with Maharishi to integrate modern science with Vedic science. Many hundreds of hours of discussion, of a very deep inquiry into this most fine level of creation, into understanding how the unified field of physics is really a field of consciousness, in understanding the physics of yogic flying. These are extraordinary topics of great concern because they signify the integration of the objective world with the subjective world, the integration of mind and matter. This really has been the goal of all of science, of all of education, to have a comprehensive understanding of not just some isolated phenomenon in nature, but a holistic understanding, a complete understanding of the nature of life, of the nature of matter, of the nature of consciousness. And really, there is no individual who is more qualified to talk about these topics. No individual who has probed more deeply, who has spent more time with Maharishi in analyzing these very beautiful connections. One of Maharishi's great discoveries of the constitution of the universe has really been a topic which John has developed very beautifully, integrated this understanding of the Veda with the understanding of physics and the unified field. It's really a great honor and a great pleasure to be able to speak these words as an introduction to the very profound talks of Dr. John Hagelin. Thank you very much.
So it's a great pleasure for me to be back to continue with the second in our mini-series of 2 talks. And the focus of this evening's discussion will be on the unified field and the field of pure consciousness, and the fundamental relationship between the unified field, which is the most basic reality of the physical universe uncovered by modern physics, and pure consciousness, which is the most fundamental aspect of individual existence, a field of pure intelligence at the basis of the mind and the basis of the body. And what I would like to do is lay out a series of arguments that confirm that these 2 fields of intelligence, the most fundamental field of human intelligence within, and the most fundamental field of nature's intelligence, the unified field at the basis of everything, that these 2 fields of intelligence are one. And I'll go through these arguments, I hope, in a relatively straightforward and time-efficient way, saving as much time as possible for discussion and participation by the audience, which I think will make the presentation livelier. Let me begin the discussion with a quick review, a few minutes, of what the unified field is from the standpoint of modern science, what we have learned through the systematic investigation of natural law for the past several centuries, really, but particularly over the past decade. And what we have found in our many years of investigation as to the structure of natural law, the dynamics of nature's order, is that natural law becomes increasingly simple at more fundamental space-time scales. That means deep within the atom and the atomic nucleus, there are transformations that occur in the structure of natural law from surface diversity to fundamental unity, giving rise to the general conclusion that although nature is superficially diverse, it is fundamentally unified. Actually, looking at this structure of the 4 forces of nature, those phenomena that are responsible for all transformation throughout the universe, the force of gravity responsible for the attraction and binding of gravitational objects, of planetary objects, for example, the electromagnetic force responsible for light and radio waves, X-rays, gamma rays, and many other related phenomena, chemistry, color, digestion, the vast majority of phenomena that we know. And the 2 nuclear forces, the strong force and weak nuclear force, respectively responsible for the binding of nucleons, protons and neutrons, to form stable nuclei, and for the occasional decay of certain unstable nuclei, radioactive decay. These 4 forces describe essentially, or are responsible for the whole range of phenomena that give rise to or make up the observable universe. And even electromagnetism, and this is the structure of natural law that we see at the nuclear level. At more superficial levels of nature, atomic, molecular, macroscopic, this situation is more or less unchanged. And physics really starts to be interesting at the level of the nucleus and subnuclear scales. These numbers on the left-hand side of this chart correspond to distances measured in centimeters. 10 to the minus 14th is the radius of a nucleus. 10 to the minus 16th is 100 times smaller, the domain of electroweak unification. But even at this nuclear level of nature's dynamics, where there are 4 functional forces of nature, Electromagnetism is, in a sense, already a unified field because it unites electricity and magnetism, which prior to Maxwell had been understood to be unrelated phenomena. So anyway, Maxwell united electricity and magnetism in the 1800s, and since that time, basically, nothing changed until about 20 years ago, when the exploration of subnuclear distances made possible by today's particle accelerators revealed a striking phase transition in the structure of the laws of nature from surface diversity to underlying unity. So that electroweak unified theory unveiled a unified, more fundamental and holistic reality from which the electromagnetic and radioactive forces were just the diverse surface expressions of an underlying unity. The profound success of this electroweak theory resulted in the Nobel Prize for physicists Weinberg, Salam, and Glashow, who proposed this underlying unity, or secret symmetry of nature. It's called a secret symmetry because it is hidden from view. It's the nature of reality at distant scales which are beyond the range of one's senses. But nevertheless, the unity is real. And similarly, we've seen this sequential development in our understanding of nature to explore deeper levels of nature dynamics, culminating in the recent discovery of successful unified field theories of all the fundamental forces of nature and the particles as well. I'll take about a minute to dwell on the most important breakthroughs that led to that unification and give, I hope in the process, a better understanding of what the nature of this unified field. And the first thing to mention, I think, is that, as I've said before, the whole language of natural law is different at deeper levels. Whereas on the surface of life, we have the dominance of matter and the appearance of physical particles. At quantum mechanical levels and smaller, this notion of particle, which is a localized system, gives way to the more unbounded reality of fields, so-called quantum fields. And quantum fields are, by definition, unbounded. They pervade the universe. And like any self-respecting field, quantum fields can sustain vibrations, traveling waves of excitation. And unlike any self-respecting field, the waves of a quantum field are not allowed to have any height at all, but discrete values, discrete heights only, as this picture shows. So a quantum field, like the electromagnetic field responsible for light, can be at rest, which is shown here, which describes a dark room, or the field can be slightly excited, which describes a room with a single photon in it. That really means the electromagnetic field is excited to a single energy level, or a more excited electromagnetic field containing twice as much energy, which, thinking in terms of very particulate language, would correspond to a room with 2 photons in it. The photon is not the reality. As you can see from the diagram, the reality is the field with different levels of excitation. So the particle becomes immaterial, and the field, as abstract as these fields are, become the sole participants in the dynamics of natural law. These are the characters that fill the stage when you're talking about physics at the atomic and subatomic dimensions. How many fields do you have? Well, quite a few. The field responsible for electromagnetism, the field responsible for gravity, the fields responsible for the strong and weak nuclear forces, that's 4, and the fields responsible for all the so-called particles of nature, one for the electrons, one for the quarks, and so forth, one for the neutrinos. So there are a number of species that populate the universe, but these are very abstract impulses of intelligence. They're not particles, but unbounded fields of intelligence that pervade the universe, which can be either at rest or in various stages of excitation. Only from a very crude particle perspective would you talk about this in terms of particles. The concept of particle doesn't fit very well, because particles, for one thing, are not unbounded. They're very localized by nature, and the reality of these fields is a purely unbounded reality. So anyway, this gives you a flavor of the language of quantum field theory and why we're talking about the unification of fields. Why the unification of fields is interesting and important. It's interesting and important because the universe is nothing but fields at these fundamental levels. And if you're not interested in fields, then you're out of luck. So, quickly to show the profound breakthrough that led to the Nobel Prize, that is the electroweak unified theory. In that theory, the electromagnetic force, light, the photon, was united with this family of forces called the weak bosons, responsible for the weak force, the radioactive force, giving rise to a miniature unified field, the electroweak unified field, where the superficially diverse impulses of creative intelligence, the electromagnetic and radioactive forces, become indistinguishable elements of a single unified wholeness. And as a side benefit, with this unification of forces becomes a simultaneous unification of particles, whereby the superficially diverse or distinct electron particle or electron field and the neutrino field, which is a very superficially different field, become indistinguishable as well. Indistinguishable components of a miniature unified field known as the left-handed lepton doublet. So at this stage, we have reduced the number of players in the universe, the number of fundamental fabrics that comprise the physical universe, from four fundamental forces to 3. Buoyed by the success of this unified electroweak theory, theorists, including those here at MIU, moved forward to propose grand unified theories of the strong, weak, and electromagnetic fields. And this is a little tangential to the talk, but I just will mention that it's a continuation of the same theme in which different forces, in this case the already unified weak and electromagnetic forces, become united with other forces, in this case the nuclear force, in the context of a single, indivisible, unified wholeness. And that's called the grand unified force field. Simultaneous, as a side benefit once again, we see the unification of quarks, responsible for all hadrons like protons and neutrons, the sub-elementary constituents of strongly interacting particles, these becoming unified with leptons, and this extraordinary unification called leptoquark unification, giving rise again to another miniature unified field, but less miniature than before, because instead of including just the electron and neutrino, the quarks are included as well. So in this way, by looking at a level of nature's dynamics which is 10 million times smaller than the electroweak unified scale, we see a further and sequential unification of all the fundamental particles and forces, a simplification in the structure of natural law. And finally, we have witnessed over the past 6 years now the emergence of a completely unified framework for understanding all the fundamental particles and forces, including gravity, which was necessarily left outside the picture of grand unification because the nature of gravity is so fundamentally different. Gravity, as you recall, is not even a quantum field theory until the scale of superunification or Planck's scale is reached. And only at that scale, where gravity becomes quantum mechanical, is there any hope of uniting it with the other quantum fields. So at this very fundamental space-time scale, which is 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, but actually corresponds in some profound respects to a mathematical point, because you're slipping beyond, really, by this stage, the ability to talk about space meaningfully. Yesterday we talked about space-time foam. If you have a yardstick embedded in space-time foam, what is the length of that yardstick? It's actually impossible to define, because the nature of space in which the yardstick is embedded is ill-defined at that point. So really 10 to the minus 33 centimeters corresponds to the point value of physics, beyond which you cannot conceive. You may think you can conceive, but if you think you can conceive of smaller distances, you haven't, fully grasped what has been said. So, in a sense, we're talking about the absolute limit of the concepts of distance, concept of time, the concept of causation. At the very foundation of any intelligible structure we see, you could even say at the very foundation of the intellect, as we'll see, is this ultimate unification of all the fundamental forces of nature. And as a profound side benefit at this point, all the so-called particles of nature, the leptons and the quarks and so forth, are simultaneously unified with these force fields. And that unification of these bosonic fields with the fermionic matter fields, like the leptons and quarks, is only possible due to supersymmetry, a unifying principle, a symmetry principle profound enough to unite opposites. And Bose and Fermi fields are really opposite with respect to their characteristics. Bosons of a feather tend to flock together. That means 2 photons of light, for example, prefer to move in perfect step with perfect phase coherence. Whereas 2 electrons, fermions, are actually forbidden from occupying the same space or behaving in the same way by the Pauli exclusion principle. So the so-called matter fields, or fermions in general, are responsible for diversification. The Bose fields in general are responsible for collective coherent behavior and for unification. So these 2 opposite tendencies in nature actually find common ground, are actually unified at this super-unified scale. And this area of unified field theory has become the principal focus of modern theoretical physics for the past at least 6 years. So we're talking about the primary thrust of all progress in theoretical physics when we're talking about unified quantum field theory. Just to mention the name of the theory, which has emerged as the most successful super-unified field theory, these are called superstring theories, or heterotic string theories, for reasons that will momentarily remain obscure. But now I'd like to begin to discuss the main subject of this evening's talk, and that is the relationship between this unified field of physics at the basis of all the matter in the universe with a unified field of consciousness open to direct experiential investigation through the transcendental meditation technique, and even more profoundly, in a sense, through the TM City program. We know from our own experience of transcendental meditation, most of us, that it's a very simple procedure which takes the awareness inside. And as a result of this very simple practice, the mind, the awareness, systematically opens to more abstract levels of human intelligence, to more abstract and fine levels of thought. And these deeper levels of thought are more fundamental, more abstract certainly, and this inward march of the mind culminates in an experience of a level of intelligence that is purely abstract and unified in its nature. We could say a unified field of consciousness, transcendental consciousness. Well, why can we call this transcendental consciousness a unified field of consciousness? Because it's unified and because it's a field. It's unified because, unlike waking experience, or indeed any more superficial level of human experience, the experience of pure consciousness is an experience of sanghita of Rishi, Devata, and Chandas. That means that knower, knowing, and known are united in one indivisible structure of experience. Another way of saying that simply is that the object of attention, whether that's a gross object of perception or even a fine thought or a feeling, has been left behind completely in that most settled state of human awareness. And when the object of experience is gone, consciousness is simply left alone by itself, wide awake within its own nature, the self experiencing itself. So the self, the experiencer, is also the object of experience. And we see this unification of the knower and the known. So certainly it is a unified state of consciousness, and quite remarkably, this unified subjective experience is reflected in the physiological correlates of that experience, a uniquely integrated and unified style of electrophysiological functioning, of brainwave coherence. So the whole brain becomes unified as the subjective experience becomes unified. So it's unified and it's a field. Field just means an unlocalized system. That's the technical definition of a field. And pure consciousness is unlocalized because any specific or localized content of experience has been transcended. And in that state of transcendental consciousness, there's nothing specific to localize the attention. So the attention is unbounded, and we call it unbounded awareness. So indeed, we have discovered through our own experience and from the Vedic tradition, which describes this experience extensively, a unified field of consciousness quite parallel to this unified field discovered by modern science. Beyond that parallel, what right do we have to say that these two are equivalent? The one, pure consciousness, being the subjective experience of this same unified field, which is now at the forefront of modern physical investigation. Well, there are many reasons. Firstly, there is the very surprising step-by-step correspondence between the structure of human experience and the structure of nature's intelligence. It has long been a remarkable fact and well recognized in physics that there is an incredible correspondence between the structure of human intelligence and the structure of nature's intelligence. Nature's intelligence is structured in layers. Human intelligence is structured in layers. We know this through the inward stroke of meditation, where the mind traverses distinctly different levels of experience, from very concrete, where the mantra or object of thought, for example, is quite concrete and specific, to very, very abstract levels of thought, each with their own logic. Mathematicians are versed, to some extent, with these very same levels of human experience. Mathematics is also structured in layers, and each layer has its own logic. There's the logic of whole numbers, very concrete. There's the logic of the integers, which includes negative numbers, something a bit more abstract, but as a result of which the number system becomes more comprehensive and more powerful. Then there are the rational numbers, including all fractions, and these certainly fill out a far more complete and comprehensive mathematical framework. More abstract than the rational numbers are the irrationals, or the real numbers which include the irrationals. And irrationals are numbers which we know exist but can never be derived through solving any algebraic equation, as a fraction or as a radical, for example. So these aren't numbers you'll ever use, you'll ever see as a solution to any problem, but we know they exist and they're necessary to complete a more powerful and holistic conceptual framework, but more abstract. And then from the reals you add the imaginary numbers, which are extremely abstract, to form the complex numbers, and the complex numbers are a step more transcendental, far more holistic, and far more powerful conceptual system. So you have, again, layers and layers and layers of human intelligence. Human intelligence, like nature's intelligence, is structured in layers. The uncanny thing about this, and what really startled Einstein and Wigner and many others, is the fact that these structures of human intelligence, which are the brainchilds of 17th and 18th century mathematicians, somehow, and for some reason, fit nature like a glove. These deeper levels of nature's intelligence require precisely those structures of the human intellect in order to formulate an understanding of them. So, in other words, mathematics, the structures of human intelligence, fit the laws of nature. The structures of nature's intelligence, they go hand in hand, and they're very parallel. So we know already through the history of mathematical science that the structures of human intelligence parallel quite closely the structure of nature's intelligence. Now, Einstein and Wigner probably didn't realize the depth of this parallel, and that although Einstein spent his life trying to formulate a unified field theory of all the fundamental forces, he was probably unaware of the fact that there was a level of human intelligence which was also unified. And had he known that, I'm sure he would have been quick to propose that the human intelligence and nature's intelligence are ultimately one. So we have this profound parallel between human intelligence and nature's intelligence. It would be extremely surprising if this most fundamental level of human intelligence and human experience were anything other than the unified field which is at the basis of everything else in the universe. So we have this common sense argument, really. Common sense argument is simply this, that the most fundamental level of human intelligence, the most fundamental level of human existence, ought to be the very same unified field of intelligence at the basis of everything else in nature. Otherwise, human existence would be somehow separate from nature or outside of nature, and it seems unreasonable to propose that that would be the case. Now, does that argument stand up? Is that argument defensible? And I think it is defensible, really, because the logic itself is certainly sound. The only thing that somebody could possibly doubt about that logic is whether this experience of a fourth state of consciousness is real, or whether it's just some kind of imagination. Is there really a fourth state of consciousness? How do we know we're experiencing the fourth state of consciousness? These are questions that one could ask. And my answer to that question is that the experience of pure consciousness is a self-evidently more real experience than the experience of waking consciousness. And there's good reason for that. In the same way that the experience of waking consciousness is sort of self-evidently more real than the experiences of dreaming state of consciousness. Why is waking consciousness, why does it seem more real, somehow more tangible than dreaming state of consciousness? Because I believe waking consciousness is a more integrated and more self-consistent style of consciousness. For example, if you're dreaming, you can have any experience whatsoever, of course, and you tend to assume that you're awake when you're dreaming. But if you stop to ask yourself, and I encourage you to try this while you're dreaming, whether or not you're really awake, at best you get an indefinite answer. I think so. But if you ask yourself in waking consciousness, which I also encourage you to do, even now, whether you're awake, you get an extremely definite answer. There's no doubt about it. What gives waking experience that additional confidence that is lacking in dreaming experience, which in comparison is so illusory? It's because waking consciousness corresponds to a more integrated state of functioning of the brain and a more integrated, logically self-consistent style of functioning of consciousness. What about transcendental consciousness? Transcendental consciousness is, so far, identified by science, the most integrated style of functioning of the brain, and certainly the most comprehensive state of awareness, completely unbounded, and the most self-consistent state of consciousness. A waking state, when you think about it, is fraught with logical inconsistencies. Mathematics and physics both have identified many of those logical inconsistencies. There's something wrong with the waking view of the world. It's good up to a point, but it has its logical limits. Transcendental consciousness seems to be beyond those logical limits. It's the more self-consistent and holistic style of functioning of the brain. So I think we're completely within our right. If somebody asks us, how do we know this experience of transcendental consciousness is real? We can ask them, how do you know your experience of waking consciousness is real? And then we can say, well, my experience of transcendental consciousness is more self-evidently real than that. And that is really a legitimate answer. And if they want to have that experience themselves and be scientific about it, they certainly can do so. There's no reason they can't verify that firsthand. So I think that argument does hold up, but for the time being, for those who haven't had that experience, I will go on to outline a few additional arguments that will allow us also to conclude that these two unified fields of intelligence are one. That there's one unified field of intelligence at the basis of mind and matter. 4 arguments, in fact. The first argument is quite familiar from Maharshi's discussions so far, and that is that these two unified fields of intelligence have identical qualities, have exactly the same characteristics. Boy, this Lagrangian is comforting, really. Never mind. What's wonderful about this formula and the reason all of you should have it, is that although it may look at a glance foreboding, it is marvelously simple when you consider that in an expression like this, or even this, because what we have here is just sequentially more elaborated expressions of the same formula. Just sequentially more elaborated expressions of the same formula. In a formula such as this, is contained all knowledge, at least all scientific knowledge. Every scientific fact that has been ever observed in any laboratory for the past 3 centuries is completely explainable on the basis of this formula. That means everything we know scientifically about the world is derivable from this. And so it really is a very concentrated package of knowledge. If you're ever deluded or lost or confused about anything, a glance at the Lagrangian will allow you to resolve any such difficulties. If you're lost on the way to Batavia, for example, instead of pulling out the map, literally pulling out this Lagrangian and working with it long enough is enough to answer any question, in principle. The value of having a mathematical formula, a very precise mathematical formula to describe the unified field, is it allows you to talk about it more concretely. There's nothing imprecise, by the way, about this mathematics. The most minor change, the changing of a 16th to an 8th, for example, as the coefficient of this line, or the changing of a plus to a minus, or the shuffling of these indices, any such change would render the whole formula ridiculous. There's logical consistency alone, that is, the principles of mathematical consistency and quantum mechanics, are enough to derive this entire theory. So there's no arbitrariness here. It's not like an artist who can dabble or brush their strokes as they wish. Logical consistency, mathematics, dictates the form of this expression. But we put it here for concreteness, and on the basis of this expression, one can derive fundamental qualities of the unified field of matter and find that they are the same qualities as we experience and associate with pure consciousness. I'll mention a few because there are probably some that are most important when it comes to describing consciousness: principles of intelligence, principles of dynamism, the principle of self-referral. Certainly, the unified field is a field of intelligence, just as consciousness is a field of pure intelligence, responsible for each and every impulse of thought. The unified field is a field of intelligence because all known laws of nature emerge from there. The laws governing electrodynamics, radioactivity, the strong force, gravity, all laws of nature governing nature at every single level sequentially unfold from the unified field and are generated by the unified field through its own self-interacting dynamics. Because the laws of nature are the orderly, intelligent principles that govern the functioning of nature everywhere, the unified field, which is the origin of all those laws, must itself be the most concentrated field of intelligence in nature. Amplifying that for a minute, without laws of nature, there would be no regularity in nature, no repeatability, no orderliness, no intelligibility. If there's no repeatable laws, if nature never repeats itself, if there were no patterns to the behavior of our environment, the intellect would not be able to place any understanding on it. It would be a completely unintelligible world. But the world is intelligible. There are principles of order and intelligence that govern the functioning of everything from atoms to galaxies. Those laws of nature are the orderly, intelligent principles, and they all spring sequentially, as this formula suggests, from the self-interacting dynamics of the unified field. So the unified field must be it's the source of nature's intelligence and the most concentrated field of intelligence in nature. It's dynamic intelligence. For reasons I mentioned yesterday, the quantum principle itself, the uncertainty principle in particular, guarantees that nature is increasingly dynamic at fundamental scales. That's why the nuclear power is more powerful than atomic power, because you're going deeper into the structure of nature. By the time you get to the level of the unified field, where you have the continuous creation and recreation of space-time geometry and the birth of universes, the level of dynamism is infinite. You can say 10 to the 99th ergs per cubic centimeter, but again, really, the dynamism is infinite, because beyond that, you can't speak in terms of ergs. Ergs are a unit of energy. The whole observable universe, which is a pretty big place, filled with stars and galaxies, if converted instantaneously into pure energy, would be an energy on the order of 10 to the 59th ergs. The level of dynamism we're talking about is 10 to the 99th ergs, 40 powers of 10 more dynamic in every cubic centimeter of empty space. That's a measure of the natural dynamism of the unified field. It's infinitely dynamic. So we have dynamism, we have intelligence. We have dynamic intelligence. And dynamic intelligence is consciousness. Self-referral, Maharishi takes to be the defining characteristic of consciousness, because Maharishi says only consciousness can know itself, can interact with itself in a completely self-sufficient manner. That is exactly the property of the unified field. So self-referral is here, or self-interacting. That just means that the unified field interacts with itself alone. And the reason for that, I think, is pretty obvious, and that is that at that level of nature, at the level of the unified field, there's nothing else for the unified field to interact with other than itself. So the unified field is purely self-interacting. And we know it interacts because it is on the basis of this dynamical interaction described by this formula. I know you don't want to be without it for a moment. It is the dynamical interaction described by this formula that is responsible for the sequential emergence of all the diverse laws of nature and structures throughout the universe. So the unified field is a field of dynamic intelligence. It's a self-referral, self-interacting field of dynamic intelligence. And Maharishi says that's enough to identify the unified field as a field of consciousness. Nothing else in the universe other than consciousness has that property. And we could go on to list 25 more, but you get the point. We have this profound qualitative correspondence between the unified field of physics and the unified field of pure self-referral consciousness. So that's the second argument. Qualitative correspondence between what is known about both unified fields. There's a third argument, which I'll show in two stages, and that is, beyond a qualitative correspondence or similarity of qualities, we now have a precise quantitative correspondence, mathematical correspondence between the structure of consciousness and the unified field of physics. And first, I'll speak briefly, not in terms of the field itself, but in terms of its most basic expressions. The most basic expressions of the unified field of physics are the emergence of the fundamental particles and forces. And if you enumerate the fundamental particles and forces and divide them into the broadest categories, there are 5. Each one of these 5 is labeled by its so-called spin. Spin, to define it, if you want to think of these fields in the most classical and concrete way in terms of their particle expressions, spin is just the rate at which a particle revolves. Certain particles are always found spinning. And among these particles, the graviton, the particle of gravity, which is again just the excitation of the gravitational field, has the highest spin. It spins fastest. It's a spin 2 particle. And then you have its nearest spin neighbor, the spin 3/2 gravitino, which must exist, although it has not been seen, must exist in the context of any supersymmetric theory, of any unified field theory. And then you have the familiar, by now, spin 1 forces, electromagnetism, radioactivity, and the strong force. These are spin 1 particles. And then the spin 1/2 matter fields, the quarks and leptons. And then finally, we have our friends, the spinless Higgs bosons. And together, these 5 categories of energy comprise the physical universe. These are the most fundamental expressions of the unified field. Interestingly enough, in the context of any supersymmetric theory, there's a natural pairing between spin neighbors. The graviton actually becomes united with the gravitino in the context of a single, more holistic entity called the gravity superfield. So there's a pairing between these two. There's also a pairing between these two spin types, in particular between the spin 1 forces and their spin 1/2 superpartners, the gauginos. And finally, there is a natural pairing between the spin 1/2 matter fields, the quarks and leptons, and their spinless friends and spin neighbors, the squarks and sleptons. So there is these pairings, and precisely these pairings, permitted by mathematical and quantum mechanical consistency arguments. Remarkably, if we look to direct experience, or look to the Vedic literature, or look to Maharshi's commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, or his many lectures on the subject, there are 5 material expressions of consciousness. The most 5 fundamental material expressions of consciousness. And in the Vedic literature, these are called Akash, Vayu, Tejas, or Agni, Apas, and Prithvi. And if you examine the properties of these 5, you find that they exist in one-to-one correspondence with these 5 material categories identified by physics. For example, what is Akasha in Maharshi's Vedic science? It's space-time as a dynamical medium. What is the spin 2 graviton, the field of quantum gravity? It's nothing other than space-time as a dynamical medium, a medium that sustains curvature and waves of vibration. So we have a correspondence between Akash and spin 2. And correspondences exist between all 5 spin types. We'll go into some in a little bit of detail. Spin 1 forces correspond to Tejas, or fire, which is responsible for chemical transformation, digestion, in the sense of sight. The only spin 1 force that exists visibly in our universe is the photon, the force of electromagnetism, which is responsible for all chemical transformation, for fire, and for light, which upholds the sense of sight. And similar correspondences exist throughout. Another interesting connection is that whereas these elements are related to certain senses, hearing, sight, and smell, these are all long-range senses, whereas taste and touch, or touch and taste, are both contact interactions, are short-range senses. Similarly, these Bose fields, spin 2, spin 1, spin 0, are responsible for long-range interactions and long-range forces, like electromagnetism and gravity, whereas the spin 3/2 and spin 1/2 fermions only give rise to contact interactions. They require touch or contact. But quite remarkably, further investigation into the Vedic literature, particularly Ayurveda and Upaveda, we find a natural pairing of these 5 fundamental expressions of consciousness into 3 more holistic entities called prakritis, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, respectively. It is these pairings, and only these pairings, that are given importance in the Vedic literature. Just as in physics, mathematical and logical consistency dictate that it is these pairings, and only these pairings, that have physical meaning. And the probability that these pairings would match like that itself is less than 1 in 100. So it becomes highly improbable that this type of correspondence, which is both qualitative and quantitative, could be due to chance. But this is a quick look at this mathematical correspondence, or quantitative correspondence, on the level of expressions of the unified field and the expressions of consciousness. In the last year or two, Maharshi has spent a lot of time exploring the nature of consciousness more deeply. And simultaneously, as if, modern science has spent much more time exploring the structure of the unified field, the superstring, more deeply. And what I'm showing here is a simplified version of Maharshi's Constitution of the Universe, but the Constitution of the Universe really just represents the analysis of the eternal structure of unity, the Ved. Ved, or Sanghita, means unity. And it's the structure of consciousness whispering within itself. the unified dynamics of knower, knowing, and known. We're not talking at this point on the level of the expressions of consciousness, but the unified, holistic nature of consciousness itself. Self-referral, self-interacting consciousness. And that structure is called Ved. Now, the structure of Ved, according to Maharshi, is not at all arbitrary. Every impulse, every syllable in this sequential expression of sound and silence is absolutely scientific, absolutely dictated by the self-interacting dynamics of consciousness knowing itself. And the most fundamental expression of that self-interacting dynamics is the first section of the Ved, or Rig Ved, and particularly the first sukta of the Rig Ved, and more particularly than that, the first richa of the first sukta of the Rig Ved. The first richa of the first sukta of the Rig Ved is shown here both in its Sanskrit and in its English, or its alliteration, and it's Agni Mile Purohitam. And this structure of 8 syllables, which is called a pada, is repeated 3 times. Agni Mile Purohitam and Yajñasya Deva Britvijam Hotaram Ratada Tamam. So we have 3 padas, each of 8 syllables, comprising the structure of pure knowledge. And that is a complete package of knowledge. And the Veda is structured in different sized packets. If you find Agni Mile Purohitam as a rather inaccessible, an inaccessibly condensed story of creation, you can take heart in the fact that there is, subsequent to the first richa, the first sukta, which is a more elaborated expression of the same knowledge. So the first richa, which is 3 times 8 syllables is 24, gives rise to 8 additional richas to comprise the structure of the first sukta. And that's the next most sequentially elaborated expression of knowledge, of total knowledge. So this is an extremely precise structure, so much so that Maharshi calls this structure the blueprint of the universe and the constitution of the universe, because it is the foundational level of natural law from which all the more diverse laws of nature unfold. The whole Ved and the Vedic literature and ultimately the material creation emerges from here. And if this knowledge is ever lost, it can be recognized, rediscovered by anyone, really, at any time, at any place, simply by opening awareness more and more clearly to its own nature. And these are just the reverberations of consciousness knowing itself. If we look to what is known about this structure of unity, the self-interacting dynamics of the unified field from physics, we find the same mathematical structure. And I'll describe in just an instant why it is what it is and why it can't be anything else. Firstly, what we're talking about is the structure of the unified field. And the modern theory of the unified field is known as the superstring. Superstring, to look at it very classically and very crudely, because that's all the time we have, is the dynamics of a relativistic string. A string is a one-dimensional object. The superstring lives by quantum mechanical and mathematical necessity in 10 space-time dimensions. An embarrassment for a while, I must admit, because we don't seem to live in 10 dimensions. But the superstring must. There's no way of formulating it, or hasn't been until recently, in any fewer dimensions. So, we have a string living in 10 dimensions. One of those dimensions is time. The other 9 are space. So what do we have? We have a one-dimensional string moving in a 9-dimensional space. Well, because it's a relativistic string, motion of the string along its own direction has no meaning. It's not definable. You can only talk about motion perpendicular to its own direction. So you have these perpendicular modes of vibration open to the string. Well, we have 2 such perpendicular possibilities for a string living in 3 dimensions. How many possibilities do you think we have for a string living in 9 dimensions? 8. Because taking away the direction of the string itself there are 8 perpendicular directions within which the string can vibrate and move. So essentially that explains, leaving out the step of supersymmetry for simplicity, why there are 8 degrees of freedom, modes of vibration open to the string in 10 dimensions. And that 8-fold structure is very fundamental, as is the structure of a pada in the first richa of the first sukta of the Rig Veda. And that's not an accident. Now, we have learned, if this expression here seems unsatisfyingly terse and doesn't seem to have a great deal of palpable meaning to many of you, you can take heart in the fact that there is a more elaborated structure of knowledge which you're going to find far more useful. And that is this subsequent 8-line elaboration of this concentrated expression of knowledge. And where this comes from is the recent formulations of string, ones we're using here in our research at MIU, but now being used everywhere, the recent formulations of string in 4 dimensions instead of 10. Sidestepping, these are direct 4-dimensional formulations of string, sidestepping the rather awkward need to supercompactify 6 unwanted directions of space. Now, so this type of string formulation is far more useful because it sort of has built into it the 3 plus 1-dimensional structure of space-time in which we live. The meaning of all of these different impulses is more transparent, because we're not talking about impulses that live in 10-dimensional space whose shadows we have to imagine moving on a 2-dimensional or lower dimensional surface. That step is skipped. We have an expression here that really pertains more to our universe, and therefore far more transparent and immediate. Just jumps right out at you. So this is essentially a more elaborated structure of the same knowledge that is contained in more concentrated form here, and you find that you have not 8 but 64 impulses, and these 64 impulses come again in 3 different varieties, one pertaining to Rishi, one pertaining to Devata, one pertaining to Chandas. And I don't think we have much time today to see why we have 3 distinct incarnations, as it were, of each of these impulses. But it is that same 3 times 8 times 9 equals what? 192-fold structure of physics, the self-interacting dynamics of the unified field of physics that corresponds precisely to the self-interacting dynamics of the unified field of the Sanghita, which is the nature of the Veda. So we had looked a moment ago on the level of the expressions of the unified field and found a quantitative correspondence between these 2 unified fields of intelligence. And now we've looked deeper into something which is admittedly more abstract, but Veda is the field of pure abstractness, self-interacting dynamics of unity. But we have found, nevertheless, that a same one-to-one mathematical correspondence between the structure of Veda and the structure of the unified field of physics, according to the most recent physical theories. So this is the 3rd argument, which I've given to you in 2 stages, for the identity of pure consciousness in the unified field, and that is the profound mathematical quantitative correspondence between these 2 fields described by modern science and by Maharshi's Vedic science. And the last 2 arguments are much quicker. I don't need transparencies for those. The last 2 arguments that I'm going to raise from my side this evening have to do with the TM City practice, particularly yogic flying, borrowing upon yesterday's analysis, and also group practice of the TM City program and the resulting Maharshi effect on society. So argument number 4, we discussed yesterday that the ability of the body to float and fly, which is being increasingly demonstrated by siddhas here and throughout the world, and which has certainly been recorded in every major tradition throughout the world, that the saints, that the enlightened have had this ability. This is a very central element of every major cultural and religious tradition, for example, and now is being essentially revitalized today in the midst of Kali Yuga through our group program day after day. We saw yesterday that yogic flying, of all the siddhis, is perhaps most dramatic in underscoring the capability of the human nervous system, of human consciousness, to function at the level of the unified field. Because it is only at the level of the unified field of physics, the level of superunification, which is the domain of quantum gravity, that you can transcend the laws of classical gravity and gain mastery over those laws. So yogic flying among the siddhis is perhaps most dramatic in placing human consciousness unambiguously at the level of the unified field. No more superficial understanding of consciousness will do. If consciousness is anything other than the unified field, if the roots of human awareness do not go deeply into the unified field itself, there is no way that individual awareness can gain mastery over classical gravity. Because it is only by transcending those laws, by appealing to a higher source, in this case quantum gravity, that those classical laws of gravity can be overthrown. And the fifth and final argument I'd like to bring to your attention is the extensive research and experience throughout the world with the group practice of transcendental meditation and the TM City program. The research over the years has increasingly shown that even relatively small groups of the square root of 1% of a population, for example, is enough to give rise to measurable and repeatable changes in the quality of life of society, to dissolve societal stress, to give rise to increased harmony and coherence in the collective consciousness of society. And increasing coherence in society and reduction of societal stress is measurable in many ways, ranging from reduction of violence and war deaths in war-torn areas, to blind content analysis of news media reports on the efficiency and effectiveness of government, to levels of crime, to levels of fires and accidents and emergency room admissions and psychiatric help calls. Every single indicator of societal stress is positively impacted by collective practice. And this research has been repeated many, many times. Perhaps the biggest such demonstration and largest sociological experiment in the history of social science took place just this summer in Washington, D.C. Preliminary results from that course are very powerful. Already published research in this area includes a 2.5-year study on the Lebanon War, during which 7 groups of different sizes and different distances from the conflict gathered together to practice the TM City program. And in all 7 instances where there were groups large enough to have a predictable influence on the history of that war, there was a very statistically significant improvement in progress towards peace, including approximately 80% reduction in violence and war deaths, which is a very concrete measure, not really open to much controversy or argumentation. The likelihood that that one study could be a statistical fluke, could be due to chance, is less than 1 part in 10 to the 19th. 1 part in 10 million that a reduction in war-related violence in Lebanon of that magnitude, sustained over that period of time for 7 successive courses, could have happened by itself. So this experiment, and this type of experiment, has placed this Maharshi effect, these field effects of consciousness, as by far the most rigorously established of any sociological phenomenon in the history of social science. But if we reflect for a moment on how this works, what is it that is responsible for the communication of orderliness throughout a society? What is the mechanism for the communication of social coherence? We're taken once again to the unified field as the explanation of the Maharshi effect, proving yet again that human consciousness, through collective practice of the TM cities, has the ability to function at the level of the unified field, placing human consciousness unambiguously at the level of the unified field. Well, what other explanations are there? In most cases, certainly in Washington this summer and certainly during the Middle East, the participants of the group meditation assemblies were not interacting with the warring factions. In many cases, they were thousands of miles away. So it's not that the individuals were communicating through a contact interaction the orderliness and coherence of their own brain physiologies on a one-to-one basis. There's some sort of extended field effect involved, an effect that could communicate this influence of orderliness across an ocean, from Washington or MIU to Lebanon. So, be it. What possibilities do there exist for the communication of such coherence? Well, we know scientifically that there are only limited possibilities. There are 4 known forces. These exhaust the bosons. And we all know that fermions can't communicate long-range influences. They interact only by contact. So we're stuck with gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces as candidates for the carriers of this long-range influence. Well, the strong and weak nuclear forces are out. They are, by nature, short-range forces that function within a nuclear distance, not beyond nuclear distances, leaving us with gravity and electromagnetism. Well, the gravitational influence is hopelessly weak. Hopelessly weak. It's about 30 powers of 10, weaker than an electromagnetic influence. So we can dismiss gravity in favor of electromagnetism. But how likely is electromagnetism? That means, say, microwaves, which would be the most logical wavelength that could be emitted and absorbed by the brain. How likely is electromagnetism as a candidate for a carrier of long-range coherence through society? Not very likely, really, because the influence of electromagnetism is also very weak. You can't measure electromagnetic influences from the brain, even really with the most sophisticated equipment, once you remove the electrodes some distance from the scalp. And we expect that influence to, affect the activities and decisions of the warring factions thousands of miles away. It's not that likely. Now, it is true there has been surprising research that shows that the human brain is far more sensitive to environmentally applied external AC fields than was thought previously likely, but still not this sensitive. And when you take into account, for example, the fact that the largest coherence-creating group in history, the group of close to 8,000 located on the MIU campus here in December, January of 1983-84 during the Taste of Utopia assembly, at that time, that group, or the largest such group, was occupying a metallic structure, the field house, the Grand Assembly Hall, and the microwaves and other electromagnetic emissions would have been effectively screened by that structure. And no such powerful diminution of the effect seemed to be there at that time. So there are many reasons you could argue that electromagnetism is not only inappropriate but far too weak, particularly to span the enormous distances involved when you consider the fact that the intensity of the electromagnetic field falls off like the square of the distance, and the distances are large. How do you overcome? Well, that leaves nothing, by the way. Nothing within the domain of space-time, within the classical arena of space-time geometry in which physics traditionally unfolds. But we know now that there is a level of reality that transcends space and time, that transcends distance, the proposed domain of pure consciousness, the domain of superunification, the Planck scale, where space and time exist in a continuous state of upheaval, where distant regions of the universe come into constant contact, as on the surface of a blanket thrown into a washing machine. A level of nature which is prior, logically, causally prior to the emergence of space and time. That is this structure, that is the reality of Ved and of pure consciousness. So it is the only way, really, of transcending the enormous distances involved, which would allow us to communicate orderliness at a distance. That is, by transcending the structure of space and time altogether, taking recourse to a level of nature's dynamics that is beyond space and time, where distances don't exist. And that is not only the reality of the unified field according to physics, but it's the reality of our own experience. Because during the state of pure consciousness, where the awareness is self-referral, there is no notion of space or time or individuality. Wholeness alone is. And it's therefore on that level of wholeness, which transcends space and time, that the communication of orderliness to any distance would become possible. And therefore I propose that the Maharshi effect, which is again the best established sociological phenomenon in the history of social science, once again places consciousness unambiguously at the level of the unified field. And once you say that it's at the level of the unified field, then you're saying it is the unified field, because by definition, the unified field is all that there is at that level of nature's dynamics, which is completely self-referral. So that's a summary of 5 arguments you can tell your mother and your friends as to why the unified field of consciousness is the self-same unified field identified by modern science at the basis of everything else in nature. Again, those 5 reasons are: 1, common sense. It stands to reason that the most fundamental aspect of human existence is the same fundamental reality identified by science to be at the basis of everything else in nature. Number 2, a profound qualitative correspondence between the qualities of the unified field of physics and the qualities of pure consciousness. The defining qualities of pure consciousness, of self-referral, intelligence, and dynamism are also the defining characteristics, really, of the unified field of physics. Third reason is a profound quantitative correspondence between the unified field and its structure, identified by modern physics, and the structure and dynamics of unity open to direct experience through transcendental meditation and described in great detail in the structure of Ved as illuminated by Maharshi's Vedic science. We found this quantitative correspondence on 2 levels. Firstly, in terms of the expression of the unified field, the 5-fold expression of material existence, and secondly, on the completely self-referral level of unity itself in the self-interacting dynamics of Ved on the one hand and the self-interacting dynamics of the superstring on the other. The 4th argument was that the physics of the siddhis, particularly yogic flying, demands that human consciousness has access to the unified field and can function at that fundamental level. And finally, number 5, the extensive published research on the Maharshi effect, which show extended field effects of consciousness, again point to the capability of the human nervous system to function at the level of the unified field, because no other field known to science is capable, really, of propagating that influence of long-range order which wells up within the awareness of everyone in the vicinity of a group. So these are the 5 arguments. There are more we could identify, but I think these are the main 5. And I think at this point in the discussion, we may have time for just a quick 1 or 2 questions or comments, and then we better close.
Dr. Hagelin, firstly I'd like to thank you very much for a really especially enlightening speech.
Thank you.
It's truly inspiring to hear this knowledge. My question is, I'd like to hear you expand just a little more on what is beyond 3-dimensional and 4-dimensional space-time, and how we could visualize that, or how we would be able to understand that a bit more, because you said there were up to 10.
Okay, very briefly, because it's not really the main subject. Once you get to 3 dimensions, essentially it's more of the same. How you visualize it, well, that's kind of a mental gymnastics that a few mathematicians are good at. But you basically visualize by interpolation. You know the difference between flatland, 2-dimensional space, and 3-dimensional space. And you extrapolate from our 3-dimensional space to imagine what the properties of 4-dimensional space must be. And like that. Now there is a little bit of a difference between our 3 dimensions of space and the additional 6 dimensions of space required for a consistent string theory. And the basic difference is that these extra 6 dimensions, which do not participate actively in the physics of macroscopic life, obviously, are hidden somehow. and they're hidden through the process of supercompactification. Supercompactification is a big word for a relatively simple phenomenon, and the simple phenomenon is that of spindling. This is a two-dimensional surface. A little sleight of hand will show how to take this two-dimensional space and make it approximately one-dimensional. That is, by coiling up the extra dimension into a radius of such small dimensions that from a distance it is effectively invisible. Well, the radius of these extra 6 dimensions in string theory, the radius of compactification is the Planck scale. So for all intents and purposes, we're left with a lower dimensional space than the one we started with. You can avoid those magic tricks if you wish to formulate string theory directly in 4 dimensions, which we've recently learned how to do, and is at the basis of some of MIU's super-unified field theories based on the string. So that's, I think, maybe as much as I should say on that subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Dr. Hagelin, I needed a clarification so I can sleep well tonight. Earlier in your lecture, you were talking about the atomic level and the nuclear level, and I understood you say the nuclear level was more profound. Did you mean atomic level, a chemical or molecular level? Or is there what is the difference between atomic and nuclear?
There is a difference between atomic and nuclear. By atomic level, a physicist usually means the diameter of an atom, including its electron shells. 10 to the minus 7th, 10 to the minus 8th, 10 to the minus 9th centimeters. The nucleus is far smaller and represents the core of the atom, which is 99% of its mass, but is approximately 1,000 times or 10,000 times smaller. And that's the 10 to the minus 14th centimeters that I put on my chart. So there's nuclear, there's atomic, and as soon as you combine several atoms into a stable molecule, you have something slightly larger, which is the molecular. The distinction between atomic and molecular is often vague. The distinction between atomic and nuclear is far more profound.
Thank you. I'll sleep better.
I'm glad.
Well, John, Maharishi's been speaking of the 27 qualities of the unified field of consciousness. And I'd like to hear how you would derive those 27 qualities from the first Richa, which has 24 impulses.
I would too.
Oh.
Thanks. Maharishi's been focusing on the 27 limbs of the Vedic literature. 27 aspects of the Vedic literature represent different fundamental qualities of Ved, of consciousness. And because they are qualities of consciousness, certainly those qualities are available in the first syllable of the Rig Veda, Ak, which is totality of knowledge, from fullness of fullness, A, to fullness of emptiness, Ka. And that same knowledge exists in the first word, Aknim, in the first Para, Akni Mile Purohitam, and also the first Richa and the first Sukta and the whole Ved. So certainly those qualities, 27 qualities, can be derived from the first Para. But to derive them from the first Pada would require, A, a knowledge of Sanskrit beyond my own, and B, especially a discriminating consciousness, very discriminating consciousness with very, very clear experience of the dynamics of Akni Male Purohitam. To see those 27 qualities lively there. It may be much easier to see those qualities if you take the whole first sukta. You could probably find those 27 words in the first sukta. But to get them from the first pada is like looking at its seed and seeing the tree. And that takes an incredibly refined intellect and discrimination. And it's really Maharishi's genius over all these years that has taken Ak and Agnim and Rik and just derived the whole universe from there. That's really the quality of a fully enlightened intellect and Brahman consciousness. And I haven't heard Maharishi derive those 27 specifically, and my answer to your question was sincere. I'd very much enjoy seeing that done.
Dr. Hagelin, in regards to point 5, the Maharishi effect, you say that it's the level just prior to the emergence of space and time, which allows us to affect at a distance. And then you went through the electromagnetism and all the other possibilities.
Right.
It seems there must be a more relative field and a less absolute field than this level prior to the emergence of space and time, because we are asked to sit close together, and we also
Right.
all have to go out to Washington, D.C.
Right, exactly.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's a very, very good point. There seems to be, at least at our level of experience and at this time in history, a value of going right in there into the, environment, the stressed environments, or being within the proximity of those environments to produce a more concentrated effect. Maharshi has also said that there will come a time, he said this in Maastricht 2 years ago, will come a time when we don't need to come out of our rooms and come together in groups or to gather in certain places. It's, he said, a quality of it's a quality of transcending, the quality of transcending, which seems to dictate whether or not the influence is truly unlocalized or whether it's somewhat localized. And the way I understand this is in relation to my own experience, which may not be anyone else's experience, but I'm more familiar with my own experience. It has to do, I think, with the degree to which the awareness is truly unbounded and the process of transcending. If there is some lingering attachment to individual awareness of one's identity, or perhaps some lingering unwillingness to let that go completely, which could be caused by stress, some anxiety, something. Not enough familiarity with the nature of that unbounded awareness as unlimited bliss consciousness. Whatever it is that could I should say bind the attention somewhat to the individual physiology, the individual identity, the degree to which perhaps we're enlivening that field in its purely holistic value is also cramped. And that's the only way I can easily explain it. It certainly relates to my own experience, how the experience or influence of pure consciousness could be limited by space or time. And that seems to be supported by Maharshi's comment that there will come a time where it won't be necessary to leave our rooms or to gather in groups to have the same sociological effect that we currently have through groups. And beyond that, really, I simply don't know. That's the only way I can understand why the influence is somewhat localized. And there's more I think I could say about that, but it's even more speculative, so I'll hold those comments.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more question, I think. Rick?
To what extent have you had the opportunity to present these ideas to the rest of the physics community? And what has been the range of their reactions? Okay. And among those who have been kind of receptive to the points, which, well, maybe you can't go into this in too much detail, but which of the points you have made are most easily accepted by them and which are a little bit more of a stretch? And then finally, when when people actually do begin to hover, what do you expect, how do you think that physicists, and perhaps again there will be a range of reactions, will come to terms with that phenomenon? Do you think they'll just say, oh, Hagelin's been right all along, or will there be still a range of degrees of acceptance?
Yeah. Well, I've had extensive experience in presenting these exact ideas to physicists throughout the world. I remember on a tour of Europe and the Middle East just 2 years ago, I presented at 108 locations, starting with Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial College, worked my way essentially throughout Europe, and ultimately the Middle East and Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. And the reception was quite good. There was often some amazement that here they were in a physics lecture and found themselves discussing or listening to a discussion of the group practice of Maharshi's TM City program as a way to prevent the Middle East crisis. Because this was on the threshold of the invasion and also on the threshold essentially of Desert Storm, that I was advocating that the scientific community promote a group quickly and just use their collective influence to establish a group in the vicinity of that part of the world to prevent the violence which ultimately ensued. So I had an opportunity to present extensively at that time. During that whole course of 108 lectures, there was never one question that was, I would say, of a negative or very challenging nature. I think they found themselves surprised to hear the extent of the body of research that supports these proposals. And I think they were surprised to hear the extent to which, of the logical consistency of the whole proposed equivalence of pure consciousness in the unified field. I would say that the response of most physicists was passive, that they didn't engage often. Sometimes they engaged dynamically in questions, but often, they found themselves interested, and then they went back to their ivory towers and continued to do what they do. Physics community is typically very content to do what they do, and that typically means the publication of their next paper. And they're not, generally speaking, a very socially active group. So in terms of rousing a response and getting them to really rally together to get the resources to create a group, this was not achieved, obviously, during that tour. But I did receive, as a result of that tour, several hundred letters and correspondence and requests for articles and further information. I think they were surprised, again, to find themselves hearing and understanding this discussion. And what surprises them is really only one thing. The physics I've discussed is perfectly familiar to all of them. What is unfamiliar to them is consciousness. And that consciousness could be something profound, something fundamental. Most physical scientists and material scientists frankly deny that consciousness exists, that there is such a thing as consciousness. This has sort of been the result of the fact that most of them were educated at a time when subjectivity and consciousness was out of fashion, and partly because the most familiar thing that they have working experience with is their desktop computers, and they therefore tend to have a very computer-like model for human consciousness as a hardware for processing information. Because the computer has no consciousness, they tend to assume that they don't either. So it's really a very naive point of view, but it is a point of view which results from the fact that these physicists have never studied consciousness, or even, I suppose, if any of them had studied Western psychology, even Western psychologists have not been in the habit of studying consciousness, not at least until the last several years. So they really have no basis, and I think by default most of them assume that consciousness, if it exists at all, must be the purely superficial byproduct of electrochemical processes in the brain, just as the activity of a computer is the superficial byproduct of electrical activity in the computer. And that consciousness may exist as something fundamental in nature that has its roots beyond the electromagnetic level and deep into the unified field. This is quite a novel idea. And I found that most physicists were quite surprised by this discussion. But I'm not surprised by that surprise. I don't consider physicists experts on consciousness. If you're going to ask a question about nuclear physics, you don't ask a dentist. If you ask a question about consciousness, you typically don't ask a physicist. So they didn't know much about this. This was new territory for them. But during all those lectures, nobody was really able to muster a question of any real challenging substance either. A lot of physicists were excited, as I mentioned, and many were, probably most were excited, but most of those in turn simply went back to work. And it may take several repetitions of such a tour to really get people to realize that what we're saying is important, and that it's vitally important for the world and for progress in their own field. Just make one brief comment before we close. The demise of the superconducting supercollider in Texas makes study of consciousness and research of consciousness absolutely indispensable to further progress in physics. Because now, as the domain of study has gone beyond the objective means of investigation of existing particle accelerators, as the domains of electroweak unification, grand unification, and superunification transcend the limits of investigation of existing accelerators, and since there are no new large proposed accelerators, physicists will have to rely increasingly on the analytic and intuitive abilities of the human mind. And without a technology to systematically develop not only the intelligence of the mind, and we know TM develops IQ, but the natural, intuitive feeling for how nature functions, particularly at its more abstract levels, physicists won't develop beyond the gift of intuition that they're born with. And that intuition of the physicists so far has not been enough to penetrate nature's deepest secrets. So without a technology to culture human awareness, to directly experience and explore deeper levels of nature's intelligence, and to experience and explore the unified field itself as pure consciousness, physics simply won't progress. And many people are predicting the end of particle physics and quantum field theory in this century, when the existing data from the existing accelerators soon runs out. So it's very important for the future of my discipline that students of physics and physicists alike practice transcendental meditation to develop their intuitive and analytical abilities, and on that basis become rishis, become siddhas, become familiar intellectually with natural law, and much more important for life, masters of natural law with the ability to function always in harmony with natural law, with purely evolutionary effects for oneself and for the society in which we live. Thank you.